Hey, world history students. Today we're going to continue talking about World War II. We've talked about the war in Europe, but remember there's a second front to this war in the Pacific between mostly Japan and the United States, where we're going from about the 1930s again until 1945. We're going to see the things that led to it and what were some of the outcomes. All right, so as you can see from the map here, if we're looking at the Pacific, Japan in yellow controls all this yellow territory. So a lot of territory in uh, Asia. They've gained a lot of islands, which used to be former colonies. This used to be French land. This used to be British. This used to be the Dutch. And the U.S. held Philippines. So they were very quick to take over all these lands because they were the only industrialized nation in Asia at that time, and were the supreme military power there. So it was fairly easy for them. Um, the problem being that they're going to run into some another major power here in the U.S. So from 1930 to 1941, Hideki Tojo, the leader of Japan that we've talked about quite a bit, promoted an extreme form of nationalism, a lot of national pride, and he also wanted to be like a European power and build a large empire. This is needed for their industrial society, for their factories. They needed raw materials that you cannot just get in Japan, so they needed to invade China. They needed to take Korea, some of these islands for oil, for several different reasons. And what we notice is that because Japan is so much more advanced than the rest of the nations, they're very quick to take over these territories, especially when you consider that the British and other countries are fighting fighting Germany in Europe. So they're kind of preoccupied, so they can't deal with Japan very well at the time. So they march quickly, and they realize pretty quickly that the U.S., after their blockade of the Japan trading ports and their embargoes there, that they were going to eventually go to war. So like we talked about, they made a preemptive attack where they struck first before we declared war at Pearl Harbor. It was trying to take out those aircraft carriers that were located in Pearl Harbor. They only got one of them. A couple others managed to make it out because they were not in Pearl Harbor at the time. But after Pearl Harbor, the U.S., it took a while for them to mobilize and take all this territory back. Before they could get there, they took the U.S. colony of the Philippines. They took Vietnam and Indonesia, some of these other places, and Southeast Asia. And they were threatening to take India and Australia too, because the British were preoccupied with the Germans back in Europe. So they were moving pretty quickly if it were not for the U.S. starting to get involved. But remember, it took them a while, so it's gonna be a few years before the U.S. can start taking these islands back. So here's a map. You can see what all they've taken. Remember, we talked about they invaded Manchuria in the 1930s and slowly marched their way down the coast and took all of this territory here, including many of the territories that are former colonies in the Pacific. We're going to see the U.S. And these purple arrows here start island hopping to try to take some of these places back. We're going to have a big change of events here at this small island. All right, so from 1942 to 1945, the U.S. finally stops losing territory in this region in the Pacific, and they start gaining some back. This is done through island hopping, or the island hopping campaign. What you can see here, they start off in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii and march their way closer and closer to Japan, taking different strategic islands along the way. So they'll start taking one island, use that as a base, take the next island, closer and closer until they get to Japan and deliver a devastating blow. Some new types of warfare that we're seeing here, the widespread use of aircraft carriers. They're used throughout the Pacific as like mini islands where they could launch their planes and lead attacks from the sea. And they're very useful. And so one of the big things that the Japanese want to do is take out these aircraft carriers. And one of the ways they did that was through kamikaze pilots that you can see here. It's a form of terrorism where they crash their plane into the aircraft carriers to take them out. It would kill them in the process, but it was oftentimes pretty deadly. All right. The big turning point in the war, though, that you got to know is the Battle of Midway. This is an island near Hawaii. It was the first time the U.S. started taking back control in that region of the Pacific. And in this battle, we first see that Japanese soldiers are a very proud people, and they refuse to surrender. They would actually commit suicide before being captured as a POW because it was seen as a more honorable form of death. So as the Allied powers, namely the U.S., got closer and closer to Japan, they took back more and more territory, but they still have not defeated Japan. Japan refused to surrender at any cost, and so the U.S. started launching firebombing campaigns where they just dropped tons and tons of firebombs on Japan, and Japan still refused to surrender. So FDR had a choice ahead of him because he had some different options to try to end the war. So one thing that he considered was a land invasion like D-Day in Japan, but that would cost millions of lives. However, he had another option on the table. But first, Franklin Roosevelt died before he could make the decision, and his vice president, Harry Truman, had to make this decision. So he had a big decision on his hands. Harry Truman is the one that's going to decide between this secret project that the U.S. had been working on called the Manhattan Project, which was a top secret mission that developed the first nuclear bomb. This would have to be a very precise hit that would take out hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, possibly. If it was struck in the right areas, this was a devastating blow that would end the war, they thought. So they could lose thousands of American lives and do a D-Day type invasion, or they could drop a nuclear bomb, which would cause hundreds of thousands to die, birth defects, nuclear fallout. You see what happens in nuclear wars. But there's no American death, so it's a big decision. I want you to think about how you would handle that decision. Well, as you probably know, he decides to drop the first atomic bomb at Hiroshima, and the Japanese still refuse to surrender. Even after the first atomic bomb that killed 150,000 people. So President Truman decides to drop the second nuclear bomb on Nagasaki, and the Japanese finally break, give in, and surrender after the second atomic bomb was dropped. And World War II was finally over because it had ended a few months before in Europe, and now it's finally over in Japan as well. All right, so you can see the armistice there, the headlines. Here's what the aftermath of the war looks like. You can see the Soviet Union had by far the most casualties, Germany as well. The United States, very little in terms of compared to other countries around. Heavy deaths in the Soviet Union, and they lost a lot. You can see about 11 million of the people. All right, here's a timeline of the events to kind of refresh your memory there. But let's take a look real quick at the outcomes. Number one, World War II was the most deadly war. It was a war that cost 60 million people their lives. 60 million people died. Europe was destroyed. Japan was destroyed. And really only the United States and Soviet Union emerged well from this. They became the two superpowers, which we're going to see them compete in the Cold War here to come. And finally, they disbanded that League of Nations and formed a better version of it called the United Nations that we still have today, which works to promote peace through discussion and policies rather than warfare. And we're also going to see all these colonies that we've been talking about for so long are going to start becoming independent from the European colonies because they really just can't hold on to them anymore. We've already talked about India leaving Great Britain. We're going to talk about some more here too, but the colonies are going to start going by the wayside and becoming independent nations. So that's a big outcome of World War II as well. All right, so make sure you're good on all the different outcomes. Go back through your notes. Let me know if you have any questions. And make sure you understand all the different aspects. Again, the timeline of events, what started the war, or the outcomes of the war, all the different things in between.